genetics and Darwinism had always had a dark side. Natural selection had long appealed to those who wanted to use it as a justification for weeding out the less fit members of society.
Not all mental deficiency is hereditary, but heredity accounts for more of the mild, feeble-minded types, such as you see in this group of men exercising in the grounds of the institution. If carefully trained, they can be taught simple routine tasks. But it would have been better by far for them and for the rest of the community if they had never been born. If we want to maintain the race at a high level, physically and mentally, everybody sound in body and mind should marry and have enough children to perpetuate their stock and carry on the race.
Post-World War II, eugenics had fallen from favor. But in the 70s, extremist groups like the National Front perpetuated the notion of racial purity. They seized on the selfish gene as an intellectual defense of their ideas.
A warm review appeared in the journal published by the National Front.
One result of kin selection is a tendency to identify with individuals physically resembling oneself and to be nasty to individuals different in appearance.
Dawkins hit back against what he saw as the political hijacking of his work.
Some people completely misunderstood what's implied by a book I wrote called The Selfish Gene. On the right, we had various writers from the National Front and French equivalents who saw the idea of the selfish gene as chiming in very much with their own rather nasty political philosophy. On the left, on the other hand, I remember being blamed in a magazine article by one influential left-wing writer, almost personally blamed for the election of Mrs. Thatcher in the last general election.
Though the selfish gene was conceived in the halcyon days of the 60s, it hit the zeitgeist in the 80s. Many still see it as a justification for a greedy, self-serving society.
During the 1980s, Thatcherism, free market economics, what I call selfish capitalism, was in urgent need of some kind of profound intellectual justification, a deeper argument to justify it. And it's interesting that The Selfish Gene didn't become a best-selling book, one that was read widely by the public rather than just by a few academics, until the 1980s. During that time, it was interpreted as suggesting that it's natural to be selfish, that it seemed to be a justification for the idea that greed is good.
When Margaret Thatcher famously said there's no such thing as society, they're only individuals and families, she was, if you like, endorsing the claim of the gene myth, that what matters is not the social organisation in which we're embedded, what matters is actually only the individuals, their genes and their genetic relationships.
People have used it and taken it as a philosophical justification for extreme right-wing politics. What is your answer to that?
To the extent that natural selection is politically unpleasant, which it actually rather is. I mean, if you were to live your life as though you were constantly aiming for Darwinian success, then the political world which that would result in would be a very unpleasant world, with the strong oppressing the downtrodden. We can emancipate ourselves politically by saying, I want to live in a kind of society which is very far from Darwinian natural selection. I'm a passionate Darwinian who believes that it's Darwinian natural selection that's given us our bodies and our brains. But I also believe that our brains have become big enough that we can rebel against that.
Although the book argues this case, Dawkins has never entirely rid himself of the accusation that his book was a defense of selfishness.
It is a lesson that sometimes people will read a book by title only and omit to read the rather large footnote, which is the book itself. The book could have been called something like The Selfish Gene and the Altruistic Individual, or even just The Altruistic Individual. That would have been a bit long.
Do you think if you'd have called it something else, we'd still be talking about it 35 years later?
I like to think that the book itself has certain merits which might have caused it to be being talked about. Yes, I think I'm kind of talking myself round to thinking perhaps that the title was a mistake.
But for Richard Dawkins, the disputes around the selfish gene are also a lesson in the importance of scientific freedom.
You cannot govern science by saying if it's suggesting something to you that's politically or morally or emotionally unpleasant, therefore it mustn't be allowed to be true. The great John Maynard Smith once satirized a left-wing scientist who was objecting to some scientific principle on grounds that it was unpleasant, more or less just that, politically unpleasant. And John Maynard Smith said, what should we have done? Falsify the equations? Of course you can't do that. Of course you can't subvert your science by just twisting it to be politically acceptable. You have to report the science the way it is. But then you can say, and let's not run our politics like that.